you need a distributed system in order to parallelize the work and try to reduce external dependencies. And obviously for the backend, we have a clear solution called microservices. Despite it was 10 years old back in the days, and now it's 20 years old, crazy. But on the front end, we didn't have anything. I work a lot in large organization, even in the past, where basically you try to scale and try to optimize your code as much as possible. You have like massive weeks of refactoring when you need to change something, struggling to introduce new patterns and stuff like that. I basically, during the trip in Japan, because we were about to launch in that country, I had 12 hours of flight in front of me. And I had to think about this challenge. So how can we do a distributed system on the front end? And that week, basically, I had the first inception of Micro-Frontends. One thing I noticed, for instance, that all the users that were interested and were already signed in, and they were interested on a football match, they didn't care about downloading the PayPal SDK or whatever, like we were doing with a single page application. Therefore, hundreds of kilobytes were shoved just leveraging Micro-Frontends and moving some key KPIs for us. Like I remember a Fire TV Stick 2015 that was back in the days one of the key devices that we're targeting, moved the starting of the application from 40 seconds to 12. And that was massive because it was just splitting logically this application in a way that works. And I think Micro-Frontends are just an architecture and is an implementation that you might use in certain situations. But majority of the time, I've seen a mid-sized large organization implementing that because they want to leverage the same capabilities that they have with microservices. And therefore, that, in my opinion, let's say helps a lot, because before was I developed the backend. But the API cannot go live because I still need to have the pull requests reviewed and merge into production. And I need to wait for other teams that finish their stuff. And then finally I can see my API and the new feature in production. Nowadays, it's with let's say with Micro-Frontends, feature flags and Canary releases, you can have a safe net where, for instance, in the past, I had developers or better teams that were deploying 20 times per day because they have like their own Micro-Frontend. They are completely independent. They can we created a safe net to say, okay, I want to deploy my Micro-Frontend to 5% of the traffic only for Switzerland and only on Chrome. First thing is, I need to build one Micro-Frontend, a single one. But there is a but, you go end to end. I design it, I implement it, and I ship to production. That will enable you to touch all that software development lifecycle end to end and understand what are the friction points. And then you can start to say, okay, so on the CI/CD, I need to treat it that way. If I'm using Monorepo or Polyrepo, I need to configure differently my CI/CD for the Micro-Frontend. Then I reach the point of deployment. Okay, what deployment strategy I want to use is a big bang deployment, maybe at the beginning, and it's more than enough. But then you need to think about, okay, so if there is a rollback to make, and they have and the entire catalog that is there, but the rest of the application is not in Micro-Frontends, how can I revert back to the previous version? So this kind of discussion has to happen at the beginning, and because you are going end to end, this approach helps a ton.
Today on Seniors at Scale, we're talking about one of the most debated front-end topics of the past decade, micro-frontends. And who else to come and speak with us with the man who literally wrote the book on it, Luca Mezzalira, author of Building Micro-Frontends, principal engineer at AWS. He has more than 350 plus conferences, talks all over the world, and he has helped everyone from startups to Fortune 500 decouple their front-end, modernize architecture, and scale teams without burning them out. Welcome, Luca. Thank you for joining me.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure being here.
So first things first, you have a new book coming out, the second edition. My first question is, what made you write the first book about micro-frontends? What got you into micro-frontends in the beginning?
Yeah, so we're talking about 2015. So before the terms micro-frontends existed, so quite a long time ago. And 10 years ago, basically, I was working for a company called DAZN, that is a live sports streaming platform. A few of, let's say, it's quite, well known nowadays. compared to when I started. Back in the days, the CTO asked me, listen, we need to scale this company, and the architecture should scale accordingly because we are going to have hundreds of developers. Funny enough, I was the second tech person hired. And back in the days when the CTO told me this, we were probably 50 people in total. But that turns out that we became 3,500 people in 18 months, 24 maximum. So it was like a massive upgrade with 550 people in the tech department. So if you think about these numbers, you understand very quickly that you need a distributed system in order to parallelize the work and try to reduce external dependencies. And obviously for the backend, we have a clear solution called microservices. Despite it was 10 years old back in the days, now it's 20 years old, crazy. But on the front end, we didn't have anything. I work a lot in large organization, even in the past, where basically you try to scale and try to optimize your code as much as possible. You have like massive weeks of refactoring when you need to change something, struggling to introduce new patterns and stuff like that. I basically, during the trip in Japan, because we were about to launch in that country, I had 12 hours of flight in front of me. And I had to think about this challenge. So how can we do a distributed system on the front end? And that week, basically, I had the first inception of Micro-Frontends that obviously is not coming from nowhere. Some of the techniques that I have learned in the past as engineer helped me to, let's say, rationalize this thing. Funny enough, back in the days when we were using Flash, because I was a Flash developer and used all the Flash platform, one of the tricks that you use for running Flash on embedded platforms, because obviously embedded platforms were extremely low resources and resource constrained, and therefore you need to think twice on how you design your system. You tend to load chunk of code at runtime more than anything. And therefore, that was the initial idea on thinking, okay, what if I can load at runtime chunks that are completely well encapsulated like microservices, and I'm able to run on any device, including smart TVs and set-top boxes. That was our primary goal in the previous company. And we couldn't use iFrames because every time that an operating system on a smart TV sees an iframe, it will basically open the browser, let's say native browser, and it basically jumps out from your application and load the browser. So we had to figure out something else that could work. And that idea basically led to, after, let's say, a few iterations, in 2017, I did my first talk on Micro-Frontends. And I wasn't too, let's say, sure that the message would land in the tech community immediately. So what I did, I went to a conference called UXDX in Dublin that is mainly on product. But basically my talk was the initial one where I opening up at the stage with 30 minutes talk. And I spent the remaining, and I spent the rest, the remaining 5 hours talking with people because they were so interested about the approach that we took. And I thought that at the end of the day, there is something here. There is definitely something that is missing. And I want to try to explore more and see, now that I've seen the first feedback from the community, what other developers think about that. And that's basically how everything started 10 years ago.
That sounds super interesting. So what was the main concept behind it? How did you do it without iframes?
It was, first of all, I had to figure out what characterized this architecture that I didn't have a name back in the days. And so I took basically the principle of microservices and having encapsulation, strong encapsulation. I wanted to have the coupling. I wanted to have the communication strategy to be asynchronous as much as possible, because it's technically used with microservices to maintain the couple your system. And then the other thing is there's clear boundaries, a strong API. So API first contract, that was, API contract first. That was one of the key things that we were using on the back end, but we didn't use on the front end. That for me was quite kind of crazy. And therefore, from that point, I started to think about, okay, so let's try to understand how the users operate in my platform, because we already launched with the monolith, and therefore we had to move in something different. So in the monolith, I noticed that there were some patterns looking at Google Analytics. And at the beginning, I didn't look into the team topology that we had in the company. I focused more on the user experience. And they noticed that basically there was this pattern where, let's assume that we have like 1 million of requests per day. They went to the landing page, From there was a drop of 40% into the sign-in sign-up journey. And from there was probably 20% or 10%, 15% that are going into the catalog. The means they were subscribed. And those were for new users. For existing users, they basically skipped everything and went straight to the catalog. And therefore, what they did was, okay, so let's try to slice how our users were using the application that more or less mirrored what we were doing on the back end, leveraging domain-driven design. And we slice in the landing page, the onboarding experience that was sign in, sign up, and the catalog experience. And then finally, we had the FAQ and help, and then my account. Those were the few micro-frontends that we created at the beginning. And that was basically the inception. And in order to do the composition, because we couldn't use iFrames back in the days, there wasn't much federation. I think single SPA was, I don't remember if it was there but definitely I didn't know about single SPA at all back in the days. So I thought, in back in the days in Flash, there was a trick that when you want to create engines for configurators specifically, you generate an XML, because JSON wasn't a thing back in the days. You create an XML, and through reflection pattern, you take an object and you transform it into something concrete. It could be a button, it could be something else. So if I take that, if I take a step back and look into this technique, what we were doing is just parsing XML. And HTML is nothing more than an XML with a specific structure. So every micro-frontend for us was an HTML page as entry point, and then there were all the related, let's say, JavaScript file and CSS file associated to it. That allowed us to do one thing that was super cool. We could pre-render a skeleton at build time into the HTML, and when we wanted to load that specific micro-frontend, we were taking all the nodes that were tagged with a specific ID and put inside the application shell DOM. And that basically enables us to provide a very snappy experience, because people started to see some stuff that was concrete, like title, footer, header, whatever. And then they started to see also the skeleton of what was loading. And in the meantime, in parallel, we were loading JavaScript, calling behind the scene the APIs and whatever. So the experience, let's say, improved drastically, especially on low-end devices. Also because memory-wise, we weren't loading like before everything. One thing I noticed, for instance, that all the users that were interested and were already signed in and that were interested on a football match, they didn't care about downloading the PayPal SDK or whatever, like we were doing with a single page application. Therefore, hundreds of kilobytes were shoved just leveraging Micro-Frontends, moving some key KPIs for us. Like I remember a Fire TV Stick 2015 that was back in the days one of the key devices we were targeting, moved the starting of the application from 30 seconds to 12. And that was massive, because it was just splitting logically this application in a way that works. And having the application shell there that helped us to, let's say, orchestrate everything was a bliss, because once that was developed, we didn't touch it anymore significantly. So we were a very stable application shell, and we iterate very quickly between teams across different devices.
And the shell, I'm guessing, kept the user information, like who is logged in, who's not logged in, stuff like that.
Not even. So we try to keep as vanilla as possible. It was even written in vanilla JavaScript. We didn't use any framework on purpose, because we didn't want to deal with dependency crashes. So considering we structured that, the main thing it was doing was routing across different micro-frontends, and taking care about the first level URL usually. So we created basically a logic where the application shell moved on the first level URL. So if it was, let's say, mysite.com/ this landing page is going there if you are not authenticated. If you were authenticated, you go straight to the catalog. So we do a rewrite and move to there. And basically it takes care only on that. Then the micro-frontend itself knows how to handle from the second level URL onwards. And the only thing we had was routing, or deep linking, because basically knows taking the first part, taking the path and removing the part that wasn't aware of. So if it was catalog and then there was an ID of a match, we were taking the catalog, loading the micro-frontend of the catalog, and then because the query string was there, the catalog knows that has to pick up the ID by convention and then starting to handle that. The other thing that was doing was a call that was critical for us. That was retrieving some configuration, because we need to know at the beginning which device the application was running on, what are the services that we're able to call, and few other characteristics. For the authentication of the user, we use a JWT token. Everything was stateless, and therefore, if there was a JWT token available in the cache or better in the cookie, we use that. If there isn't, we need to authenticate. So we redirect the user to the sign-in page. As simple as that.
Yeah, very cool. Very cool. And did each micro-frontend was also in vanilla JavaScript, or did they have their own frameworks?
No, they were using React and MobX. So I asked I didn't want to define this, because obviously there were a lot of other engineers that should work on that. So it shouldn't be fair, to be honest, that I decide for everyone. So I asked them to create a POC. So they have, let's say there was a group of people, roughly 10 people that work on these POCs, try different technology, different state management. They try Redux, they try MobX, obviously React. I don't remember if they try also Vue, could be. It was 10 years ago, so time flies. But at the end, we ended up with MobX State Tree and React. That, to be honest, was the combination that I hoped to see. But obviously, I didn't want to say anything, because I know that otherwise people felt that I was forcing the decision to them. Instead, they tried. Wherever they decided to have was the one that we went.
So did each micro-frontend have its own MobX, or it was one global MobX state that micro-frontends reused?
Zero global state. That for me is as an anti-pattern, because the problem of global state is not that technically it's not doable, but it's difficult to let's say deal with situation like, oh, we need to rush because we have a delivery, so let's take a shortcut and put in the global state, and then sanitize that, or having a change on a scope of a variable, like from moving from object to number or whatever it is. If it is global, means retesting everything. So you have like quick turnaround on the development side, but a long journey into the testing phase. And also the possibility to, let's say, blow up something at runtime. That is one of the main worries for me. So every single decision that we made was for the stability of the platform. So what has to be shared has to be carefully crafted, with the specific guardrails in place. And over the years, we learn how to do that. But every, let's say, Micro-Frontend has its own MobX, let's say, instance, also because it's not a global, it's a tree that you could use and allows you to add and remove leaves. And therefore, that became very easy to handle, especially for each single Micro-Frontend. I think if you think nowadays, if you have like a Zeus stand or any other system works similarly. Because for us, also memory was a thing. Very often, at the beginning, we did some trials on taking a snapshot of the window object when everything was loaded. So the application shell was loaded. And then after unloading a Micro-Frontend, we were cleaning up and purging all the objects that weren't originally present before loading a Micro-Frontend. That helped us to keep the memory low, and also handling the memory in low-end devices in a decent way. But we had a lot of to be honest, satisfaction, because when we see something as complex as a Netflix application that is dealing with live content running smoothly on a multitude of devices with a lot of fragmentation for browser and capabilities, that means that the architecture stands.
Yeah, makes sense. And how did you solve the issue? Like, of course, you really cared about bundle size because you're developing for applications. And how did you make sure that not all micro-frontends have React or vendors packages duplicated, basically?
So at the beginning, there wasn't a way. So we accepted the trade-off that every Micro-Frontend was loading its own dependencies.
Okay.
So we accepted that because what we noticed is that the React itself and MobX were roughly 50K minimized. And therefore it wasn't, let's say, a big burden on that side. We were very careful adding other libraries into the mix. One thing to keep the budget size under a certain threshold, we created a guardrail that basically every time that the developer was creating a pull request, We were in GitHub, we were using the GitHub hook. We were spinning up a Lambda function that contains Webpack. We were building on the fly the specific Micro-Frontend and checking that was inside the specific threshold that we defined for that Micro-Frontend. If it was over 20%, 15% of the size, you couldn't merge. So you have to go back and justify why you are having that. And if we just this simple trick or guardrail, we were able to pick up a lot of, let's say, opinable things that developers were doing. And we reviewed that at the beginning. So shifting left as much as possible. I'm a big fan of trying to provide a very smooth and concrete developer experience for developers when I work in companies. And therefore, this approach helped us to reduce those complexity.
That's cool. So what were your main learnings here in this period before that you put inside the first edition of the book? I'm guessing this was before Module Federation came out, all these.
Correct.
Yeah. So what did you learn that you think that really helped us today?
I think the first edition had a ton of great insights on how to look holistically on the system. The thing that people often misunderstand is that they look into Micro-Frontends like they look into React or Angular or whatever. And definitely Micro-Frontends, like any other distributed system, the problem is not technological. The problem is everything else. It's the governance, how you structure the teams, how you are communicating with the C-suite, how you create the guardrails, and so on and so forth. So the real challenge of Micro-Frontends is understanding how to design an application, because up to now, or if you think about since 2015, the first, let's say, big change in the front end was the obviously React with let's say all the ecosystem that they created back in the days. That was a massive change on the way how everything worked, the virtual DOM introduction and whatever. But even since then, developers weren't really designing applications. They were cherry picking some libraries with design decision made by others, and then saying, "Oh, I'm an architect because I'm designing an architecture." In reality, you are not designing architecture. You are, let's say, plugging different libraries with design decision made by others, and you just decide to apply those decisions. It's a completely different thing. Therefore, nowadays, instead with Micro-Frontends, there is a challenge that developers are not used to think about holistically of what architecture means. They think that it's just the technology aspect. The technology aspect is easy. Again, you cherry pick certain libraries that have solved certain problems, but now you have the problem to understand how granular is a Micro-Frontend, how I split it, how many do I need to have inside the view, how do I communicate, how do I collocate code or I don't collocate code, and stuff like that. That becomes really interesting because certain decision can affect drastically also the engineering culture or the way how you structure the teams. And the not understanding that, thinking that is just a regular library, is what usually fails when you implement Micro.
And how do you prefer doing it? Like Micro-Frontends from the start, or do you think it's normal to go like a app, build it, and then split it into domains? Once you, like you said, I like this how you split it. Okay, you have the landing pages, the catalog, and the other pages.
Onboarding, yeah.
Onboarding, yes.
So I truly believe that majority of the time, unless you work for a massive company, you shouldn't start with Micro-Frontends. I think Monolith has absolutely a place in everything, front end and back end, and there is no shame on implementing that. I don't believe in hypes. I don't think Micro-Frontends are a hype. I think Micro-Frontends are just an architecture and is an implementation that you might use in certain situation. And majority of the time, I've seen in mid-sized large organization implementing that because they want to leverage the same capabilities that they have with microservices. And therefore, that, in my opinion, let's say, helps a lot. Because before was, I developed the backend, but the API cannot go live because I still need to have the pull requests reviewed and merge into production, and I need to wait for other teams that finish their stuff. And then finally, I can see my API and the new feature in production. Nowadays, it's with let's say with Micro-Frontends, feature flags and Canary releases, you can have a safe net where, for instance, in the past, I had developers or better teams that were deploying 20 times per day because they have like their own Micro-Frontend. They are completely independent. They can we created a safe net to say, okay, I want to deploy my Micro-Frontend to 5% of the traffic only for Switzerland and only on Chrome. And they could test with this parameter and see live traffic going towards the Micro-Frontend without affecting de facto the rest of the application. It was working like a charm. Especially this team has to deal with the video player heuristics. So it was a fairly complicated things that you couldn't try, let's say, just with fake video, especially because we mainly work with live content. And therefore, the way how you optimize a video player for live content is different from video demand. So for doing that, they tried with real traffic. And because we created this nice safe net that developers could decide the percentage of traffic that was going towards a new version of Micro-Frontend, in which country, in which device, and stuff like that. And we were picking up everything on the edge. That simplified drastically the thing because we didn't even have to change an API in the background or the application shell. Application shell was neat. I decided to decouple basically the routing part because it was helpful for applying a strangler pattern on the edge. So I don't have to pollute the code of the application shell and then, let's say, delete it when everything was migrated or make a change on the fly because one Micro-Frontend didn't work. I just said, okay, so the request has to pass through a CDN. I can have like compute on the CDN. So let's use that and serve either the single page application or the Micro-Frontends one. So we can start to have immediate value to the company and the users because we can ship the first Micro-Frontend that we have, test it in production. If it doesn't work, we just redirect the traffic to the old application and everything will work like a charm. And because we have done in this way, we saved a lot of headaches further down the line. And I think this is, let's say, something that I learned in the hard way the first few years when I wrote the first book. Then with the second one, I rationalized, democratized. And nowadays, if you see single page, single SPA, as well as Mod Federation are starting to embrace this idea of manifest, for instance, in Mod Federation is called for loading that. That was a workforce that I created with Zach, that is from the creator of Mod Federation, with Joel, that is the creator of Single SPA, and Matteo, that is the creator of Open Components, three of the main frameworks for building Micro-Frontend. And we discussed about how can we solve this once for all. And we created this schema that is discovery schema that enables you to, let's say, discover your Micro-Frontend and apply Canary release and quickly deployment if you want. That I think was why the massive change that we have, a breakthrough that we have like 2 or 3 years ago.
Wow, that's really cool. Yeah, I think I heard about this before. I personally never used it, but I've heard, I think I talked to someone at Zephyr that is like a platform that basically orchestration of Micro-Frontends and you can orchestrate them at scale, which I think does this, if I'm not mistaken.
Probably Nestor, I guess.
Yeah, Nestor. I meant Nestor. Yeah, that is really cool. So one question about this that I not on this exactly, but one issues that I had with microservices, like I used to work at Glovo and we had like the same like 500 engineers and it was like a big Java monolith and the goal was to break it down into microservices. But with 500 engineers, you have this issue where even if one team was breaking out the microservice in 3 weeks, 4 weeks, by the time it was ready, the monolith had other changes already. So it became impossible to keep 2 versions in sync while breaking out a version. Of course, you have to do code freezes and stuff like that. Have you seen the same in front ends, the same issues? And if you did, how can we handle them?
Yes, it could happen. The thing is there is a coordination between product and tech in this case. However, think about that. There are different ways that you can create Micro-Frontends. You can create what I call the vertical split. Basically, is a single Micro-Frontend that represents a view or a group of views all together. Or you can have an horizontal split where you have multiple Micro-Frontends in the same view. A majority of the time, let's say new teams are embracing the vertical splits. It's easier, let's say, many companies first starting that way. And there is another perk that if you go very granular at the beginning, especially when you are not very comfortable to design boundaries, you might risk that at some point you screwed up something and you need to trash one micro-frontend and rebuild it inside another one. That is waste of time and energy. And the other thing that if you use the vertical split approach, is easier, in my opinion, to migrate, because with horizontal split, you start to have maybe one micro-frontend inside the monolith. And if something blew up, you don't have a quick fallback. You cannot say, unless you start to implement feature flags, pollute more code, stuff like that. While if you intercept the request and the route on the edge, or let's say in other ways, if you want to do application shell, do application shell. I prefer on the edge because I think it's neater. It becomes, let's say, a breeze. So if you think about this, even if you have a single page that is composed by multiple micro-frontends, build, let's say, the 3, 4 5 micro-frontends you need on that view and ship them all together. So that simplified drastically. I have some companies that I helped in the last few years where, for instance, it was an e-commerce. Imagine like a sort of IKEA. It wasn't IKEA, but a sort of. And they decided to first have the first micro-frontend that was the mirror stage in the e-commerce. The rest of the e-commerce was, let's say, normal, monolith, was working normally, but the mirrors page was in micro-frontend. So they shipped that, they learn about that, and then they made some changes. They had to revert back a couple of times because they screwed up some stuff, and then they moved full on micro-frontends when they made the adjustments. But that was, let's say, a good learning approach, because in distributed system, if you have done, let's say, the migration, you know better than me, that it's not, let's say, a walk in the park that you just create a template and a blueprint and you just apply everywhere. It's not going to work, because every single part of the workload has its own characteristics, architecture characteristics and design requirements, stuff like that. And therefore, when you think about this approach that is very iterative, and you can route on the root part of the first level URL, the root part of your system, it becomes easier. Even if you think about Next.js, when you use multism, they tend to route on a specific part, and they have like soft navigation inside a specific route, while you have hard navigation between routes. How you want to slice the route usually should be led by your system/teams. So, for instance, I have the teams that sometimes have 2 micro-frontends to handle, but for their decision, and everything was handled inside that team. It wasn't, let's say, shared or managed, because obviously there is complexity. There is more governance. There are more, let's say, external dependencies that you need to think about. It's not a walk in the park when you say, I go with an horizontal split because I have more flexibility. True, you have more flexibility, but the trade-off, because it's always a trade-off, you will need to create more boundaries and more guardrails to make sure that it doesn't blow up in production.
So, in your opinion, what are the main takeaways from your first edition book?
The main takeaways is definitely the architecture remained the same. That is great. The other thing is I created the vocabulary that now, back in the days, obviously was what I used inside my organization, and now became globally adopted by everyone. I literally join discussion with teams in New Zealand or in Silicon Valley, and they're telling me, oh, we have a vertical split. And the first time that I heard that, I was like astonished that, okay, I know exactly what you're talking about. How do you know that? And it was super funny because basically that book became the fact one that created the vocabulary, the patterns, the anti-patterns, and provide overall idea on how micro-frontends could be made and implemented worldwide. And for me, it was, let's say, obviously great, because I heard so many times, I read your book, I started to implement it, it works, or it doesn't work, and those are my problems. So that for me was, starting from my small room where I started to create these things and having a global rollout translated in multiple languages and stuff like that was massive for me. And the second edition obviously started to build on top of the first one. The first one, I think, was cornerstone for the Micro-Frontends part, because nowadays there were other ways. At the same time, there was a Michael Gear's book that was that came out slightly earlier than mine, and Florian Rappel as well. Even if you read the Michael Gear's book, there are a lot of vocabulary that they use for identify specific parts. Not everything was, let's say, well intercepted by the community and designed with the community. With became slowly but steadily more common, also because I started to hammer a lot on conferences, because I was starting to be invited in several conferences back in the days. And since then, I continued over the past 10 years. I think there is a lot of the Micro-Frontends community is not large. So the key actors are talking about 20 people more or less worldwide. But they are very strong. Everyone contributed very well. Everyone is extremely passionate. We know each other. We chat with each other. We work with each other sometimes when needed. And I think that is also the power of this small but nowadays important community.
I was just going to ask, but I think you answered a little bit, like what made you start the second edition?
The second edition I started 2 years ago, or was February 2023, 2023, yeah. Everything started because O'Reilly pinged me and they were telling me, listen, your book is almost 5 years old. Do you have anything else to talk about Micro-Frontends? Because it seems that resonates very well with our customers. We have seen a constant, let's say, flux of books that were sold with your title, and therefore we would like to understand if there is opportunity to have a second edition. I said, listen, I have plenty of stuff that I can confirm in the second edition, and I can add a lot more nowadays, including also the generative AI part, because the last chapter is on that. And therefore, I embarked in this journey 2 years ago. It took me 2 years because I basically ripped apart the first book. I removed 2 chapters, created 6 or 7, something like that, and then updated other 6 or 7. And it was, let's say, basically another book. Because there are some parts that are common, especially the CI/CD part, the automation part. There is some part that are in common. That, for instance, I split it up in multiple chapters because I had to explain better the discovery service approach and apply to Micro-Frontends that called front-end discovery. And I think explaining also Canary release, blueprint deployment, and making concrete to other people. Also, I create some stories around how you could migrate from a monolith to Micro-Frontends. There is a chapter dedicated to that, showing also that, yes, maybe now there is the front-end discovery approach, but you don't have to implement straight away. It can be, let's say, something in the roadmap. And when time comes, when it hurts the most, you can start to introduce that. Obviously, if you have time, great, implement that. But I try to simulate what I've seen over and over again in other companies, even in my previous companies. You have a lot of ideas, but obviously you need to ship features, you need to do other things. It cannot just thinking about, oh, let me create this super amazing guardrail straight away. The thing that I described came up over the years. It wasn't something that we designed at the beginning, implement straight away. It was literally, okay, now we have this problem. We are going to solve in this way. We had already a first discussion, so now it's time to implement it. And we take like a group of people, we started to work together and we implement that. But it was like in a couple of years, you start to have all the guardrails, the dashboard that enables you to deploy in a specific country with a specific version of Micro-Frontend with a specific percentage. Though the other things basically was arising slowly but steadily when friction was signaling us that something didn't work as expected or some assumptions were wrong. So that's why I really like, let's say, applying modularity in architecture, because if you apply properly, you tend to have like some friction that a signal to you, oh, by the way, these things that you were thinking doesn't work. And many people usually think, oh, it's the architecture that doesn't work. And I strongly believe it's not. Architecture is doing exactly what it should do. So signaling something is not working through friction. That could be at the, I don't know, slow deployment. It could be something else. It could be that you deploy every time too many external dependencies. You deploy every time two Micro-Frontends together. So that means that boundaries are not designed properly. So there are a lot of things, in my opinion, that has to be taken into account. And you cannot really just think of, oh yeah, use single SPA, module federation, Next.js, whatever done. It's way more complicated than that.
Yeah, for sure. But would you recommend someone, let's say they want to start from scratch a project, they're not who's going to be big. Would you recommend them build their Micro-Frontend architecture from scratch or use a framework like module federation or web fragments or whatever?
No, from scratch nowadays, I think is not needed anymore. Back in the days, like 10 years ago, there wasn't anything. Nowadays, there are a lot of options. So depends from, let's say, what you're looking for. But I think if you think about like there is Pyral, module federation, a single SPA, web fragments, web components, because there are many people are building also with components. You have Next.js, Astro with Astro Server Island. So there is a lot of flavors available out there, and I'm sure I'm missing some of them. I don't remember the name of the one from TikTok. Will come to my mind. But there are a lot of frameworks out there that are currently available. So you don't need to build also, because the frameworks are not as opinionated like you are basically taking into Angular, apart from obviously Next and Astro that are the most opinionated. It's, let's say, a lightweight framework that helps you to compose, route, and handle dependencies that are the main things that the main struggle of micro-frontends. So even, for instance, I know that you speak with Natalia recently. With web fragments, you can use the technology you want. It's not, let's say, bounded to a specific technology. But I think is also the what I call the transparency principle that I would like to see in every framework for micro-frontend. Today maybe it's React and Angular that are the largest and biggest one. Maybe tomorrow there will be another one, but that doesn't mean if you design properly your architecture and your library that you can support them. As long as they remain in certain standards, you should be able to. So I personally really like this approach, and I like how the different frameworks owners and designer and maintainer have implemented their own, obviously with their strengths and with their weakness, and you need to understand when to use what. After that, I think it's just, for instance, in the first and second edition of my book, I wrote like a chapter that is a monster. It's roughly 60 pages, where I describe I categorize every single let's say framework that is most popular one, because more nowadays, there are many. So I try to keep that simple and go with the most popular.
Nice. And you specify in which case you should use this one and in which case you should use that one. So cool.
I basically created for each of them a table where I assign a value. I don't remember if it's from 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, but I would say 1 to 5, regarding how I feel about the developer experience, simplicity, and a few other characteristics. So I try to divide first of all, the main division is horizontal versus vertical split, because at least up front if you're going to do one or the other one, that are not mutually exclusive, by the way. You can also mix and match, and then you have a server-side rendering one and client-side rendering one for each single division. I would say client-side rendering nowadays is the most stable area that I've seen. Server-side rendering is still, let's say, there are some good moves at the moment, but there isn't a clear winner. Let's put it down.
Got it. So what are some of the core principles behind like a successful micro-frontend architecture? What do you think needs to be done?
But first of all, investing time on designing the system and looking into the socio-technical aspect. That personally, I'm seeing, let's say, this part not always done properly at the beginning, because they think this is a waste of time. In reality, you don't have to design everything up front, but have at least a North Star to follow. That when you arrive to a roadblock, you know what are the principles that you are looking at. That I think is important. Secondly, looking into your existing system, if you have one, and how your users are interacting with that, and understanding how you work inside your context. Because the other thing is, very often I've seen maybe there is this staff engineer or senior engineer that is bringing a lot of value and a lot of experience into a company that maybe doesn't have all that experience. So understanding your context is critical. Very often, if you think about that, you can write everything in functional programming, but maybe functional programming is not something that is digested or assimilated easily by the people that are working with you. So has its benefit, of course, but the final benefit is creating something for your customers. Therefore, you need to find a middle ground and then ramping up the people towards the direction of travel that you want. You cannot immediately drop the bomb and say, okay, from now on, we use, Scale and this stuff, and everyone is using it that way. It doesn't work in that way. So you need to understand your context and what you need to express. And the other thing is start iteratively. Don't think I need to do everything in one go. First thing is I need to build one micro-frontend, a single one. And but there is a but, you go end to end. I design it, I implement it, and I ship to production. That will enable you to touch all that software development lifecycle end to end and understand what are the friction points. And then you can start to say, okay, so on the CI/CD, I need to treat in that way. If I'm using Monorepo or Polyrepo, I need to configure differently my CI/CD for the Micro-Frontend. Then I reach the point of deployment. Okay, what deployment strategy I want to use is a big bang deployment, maybe at the beginning, and it's more than enough. But then you need to think about, okay, so if there is a rollback to make, and they have and the entire catalog that is there, but the rest of the application is not in Micro-Frontends, how can I revert back to the previous version? So this kind of discussion has to happen at the beginning. And because you are going end to end, this approach helps a ton. And it's the same thing that you do with microservices, by the way, because with microservices, usually you create a CCOE or a Cloud Center of Excellence, or let's say a group of people that is multidisciplinary, and they work together in order to take into account for the first microservices, what is the North Star for security, what is the North Star for observability, cloud decisions, architecture, programming languages, stuff like that. And you would do the same on Micro-Frontends. In fact, I deliver several times my talk on the ideal Micro-Frontends platform, where I talk about this inception phase, where you need to create a platform team like you would do for distributed system that takes care about cross-cutting concerns. At the beginning, there are many. Slowly but steadily, that part will become more stable, but still in every Micro-Frontend implementation, let's say group of people, even if it's not, let's say, regularly working together, let's say a virtual team that are working when it's needed, they should take care about the cross-cutting concern. So there is a new feature that will affect all the Micro-Frontends, or there is a new version of React that changed completely the way how the virtual DOM is created, for instance. So you want to migrate from React to Angular or vice versa. You need to have a group of people that understand holistically the system and trying to help everyone else to apply. Okay, so now here we are doing this, and that, and so on and so forth. And plus all the infrastructure part, if you want, because obviously there is always infrastructure to handle security and other things. I think that is a good starting point. So if you are capable to develop the first Micro-Frontend thing, composing this platform team, sometimes it's called Tiger team, sometimes it's called core team, depends on the company. And then you are capable to understand the software development lifecycle and map it, and understand where Micro-Frontends should change the software development lifecycle. I think you are in a very strong position for then continuing and iterating and adding new capabilities.
Very interesting. A question like on the reverse side, when do you not recommend people build Micro-Frontends?
If you have a project that has a time limit associated to it, like you're building a web application for an expo, and you know that in 2 months' time that will be trashed, don't even think about Micro-Frontends. Go with something that provides a slick developer experience, something that you are extremely productive with. It could be even jQuery for what I'm concerned with, because in reality, the value is hitting the milestone. That is the real value, not the technology behind that. I don't recommend when you have, let's say, 2 or 3 teams. I mean, if you really need Micro-Frontends for 3 teams, you have bigger problems inside your organizations. Because in reality, is like we're talking about probably, I don't know, less than 10 people that are working together. If they cannot work together properly and chat with each other and exchange ideas, it's a challenge. We built monolithic system in a modular fashion with strong boundaries and whatever encapsulation, all the other design pattern that we and principles that we have for decades. I don't see why now we shouldn't. But there are certain situations, for instance, if you are a small team and you are working with a SaaS product. I was talking with a company in Canada 6 or 7 years ago that were basically saying, listen, we want to implement Micro-Frontends. In total, the developers between backend and frontend, we have 15 people, so not many. But we want to use Micro-Frontends in this way, and they walk me through their reasoning, and I think it has a lot of potential. So this basically software was, the software for when you go to the restaurant, you have like the till on an iPad where you have the schema of all the tables for the map of all the tables. And then you have some parts that are quite common, like you have the sign in, the customer support, you have like the settings, stuff like that. Those are common. So what they did was literally divided the application in 3 or 4 Micro-Frontends. One was the custom one. That was the map and other features that a restaurant could ask for. The other 3 were sign in, sign up, and I don't know, settings or whatever it is. So 3 of those micro-frontends were always the same for every single customer. Some feature flags, but nothing more. So they said, listen, I developed this. Those are extremely stable. They are not changing very often. Maybe we touch them once or twice per year. And we work mainly on the other chunk. And we know that when we are deploying these micro-frontends, we don't need to test all the rest. We don't need to handle the complexity or maybe blues up something, because the rest of the system is untouched. It's stable, it's working, well released. I don't have to spend time on testing everything every single time that you do in a single page application or in a monolith on the server side rendering. And that was a breeze for them, because there was a bit of overhead at the beginning to understand what was the stable part, what wasn't, and creating the infrastructure for handling that. But from that point on, they move extremely fast because they just have that chunk to develop. So if there is a new onboarding of a new customer, it was literally, okay, select this free stable micro-frontend, develop the part that is dedicated for that customer.
Yeah. I think we have the same thing now. In my startup, we're very small. We're like 11 people, developers, but the main app is very big. And we're not doing CI/CD every day, so we're manually deploying. And I got to a point where one team wants to deploy, but other team has things in main that are in testing. So I would love to have micro-frontends just for the deployment part, so each team can deploy independently.
To be honest, it's not too complicated in my opinion. And it's one thing I want to let's say, show next year. I want to spend some time for presenting a framework, a lightweight framework for micro-frontends for smaller teams. Because in the recent, I would say the last 12 months, I've seen quite a lot of small teams started to embrace that, but not fully. That's the interesting part. They took some chunks of micro-frontends and they didn't care about others. Like, for instance, you were asking about the budget size. Other teams, they say, we are not bounded to that. And the only thing that we need, like especially client-side rendering, if you don't have server-side rendering and you're, so if you have server-side rendering with the managed framework, I don't know, next on Vercel, there is a lot of stuff that are developed by Vercel. You don't have to do that. You just literally take what they provide to you. There are a lot of goodies that otherwise you need to build by your own. The other thing is these teams basically we're doing a single page application, split up in 3. And I create an application shell that is very lightweight. So the effort for building that is very low. And maintaining it is similarly, because I don't have a lot of things that are changing. Therefore, I just route things and loading things. And sometimes they don't even do that. And they basically ship, let's say, chunk of the single page application independently.
Yeah.
And I think it has legs.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, for us, we need it for sure. I wanted to ask, like, now, because there's a lot of AI and stuff, do you recommend like for micro-frontends, like a monorepo type situation or polyrepo for multiple, each micro-frontend its own repository?
I have seen both approaches working very well. The main challenge, again, we're going back to the socio-technical system, is what you have when you choose one or the other approach. Because when you choose monorepo versus polyrepo, it's negligible the part related to tech. Yes, in one, you have everything available in one repository. The other one, the discoverability is harder. But the reality is, in the monorepo, you need disciplined developers that they are capable to understand that they shouldn't take a shortcut. You need to create guardrails to make sure that the people don't start to create recursive dependencies, or you don't start adding the shared library stuff that shouldn't be shared, and stuff like that. So there is more definitely work to do in the monorepo. The other thing is polyrepo allows you to use any tool that you want because it's a small one. Monorepo, you need to use specific tools. And when you reach a certain level, obviously Facebook or Google, you need to build your own solution because no one else is dealing with that scale. Then you have also on the version control system, you need to think about, okay, what's the branching strategy? So in 99% of the time, I've seen implemented a monorepo with trunk-based development. But trunk-based development is not a walk in the park for junior developers because they, the feature, the branch that you are going to do is very short-living compared to a GitHub approach where you have like your features, you can work even for a week, despite I discourage that. And you have, let's say, a completely different standing compared to the other approach. So to be honest with you, I think this monorepo polyrepo is not related to the code that is running, but to the context of the engineering practice that you place. Because I remember back in the days, for instance, I'm a big fan of trunk-based development because I remember how much I struggle with the hot fixes branch, and then you need to remember to merge into master, and then you need to remember to merge in develop, and then finally you can start to merge into let's say again into the feature branch, and then start again. It was complicated. It was long. You have, let's say, a lot of tools that helps you with that, especially on the CLI. But just reasoning about that, it wasn't a walk in the park. In trunk-based development, everything is simpler, but that forces you to do a better job at the beginning of the process when you define your task, because the task cannot be a 1 week work. It should be short-living, like 2 hours, 3 hours work. Therefore, you need to really spend time and say, okay, this massive chunk of feature, how can I split it in small things that doesn't break anything? I can always ship my main. And it's not easy, especially if you have to coordinate with multiple teams. So if you have, let's say, a company that allows you to do that, go for it. But in general, you need to understand what you are subscribing for.
Yeah. I think one issue that I've saw with not micro-frontends in general, but team topology and how you break teams up. And I feel like micro-frontends would help a lot, but it can also lead to sometimes like two teams building the same solution, each in their own micro-frontends. For example, a chat. Like I think this happened with my previous company where one team built a chat in their micro-frontend, and because it was vertically split or something, like it was vertically split the micro-frontends. And then 3 months later at the promo, another team raised their hand and say, hey, we also build a chat.
Yes.
How would you recommend these teams communicate better with each other?
So there are forums that usually you create. We had a similar problem at the beginning, not for duplication code, the duplicated code, but at some point, what we wanted to achieve is a team that were independent. And we achieved that very quickly.
Yes.
The problem is at some point, the team started to say, listen, I started to be a bit bored that I know exactly what's happening in my team, but I don't know what the others are doing. Can we do something for fixing this problem? And we started to think about what can we do to have a information flowing better. So we created the community of practice for front-end and for back-end, where the front-end developers were, let's say, meeting together every month and then chatting about, they were doing a presentation, how to solve a specific problem. We had a town hall experience every month in every dev center where people were sharing their successes, what they were working on, or what are the challenges that they face, stuff like that, or the library that they want to share and handle across. But then also my team of architects was responsible for that kind of things, because I put basically ourselves in the middle of the feature design. So when a product person was saying, okay, we need to build this, the first thing that was doing is writing a document. And then we had the architects at the first meeting was architects, was the PMs and the different, let's say, key stakeholders. And then the second review, we started to invite the staff engineers, the lead developer, or the QA, whatever, from the different teams that were involved. So before we start to write a single line of code, people know exactly why we had to build that and how. And from that point on, the most critical, let's say, implementation we're handling through event modeling. So we were going on a whiteboard with the UX people, the developers, the architects and PM, and we were modeling the screen. So if the user is clicking this button, this information goes to the backend, store this information into the database, and then it returns this information back to the client moves to the new view, and so on. And we went to map these things. Usually that was only for critical things. So we did sporadically. But the rest was still, let's say, having the teams working properly. Back in the days, pre-pandemic, we were talking, the world was, let's say, all working from the same office. So even there, I remember vividly, I basically stopped a meeting where the CTO was present. I dragged him physically out from the meeting. I said, listen, I know how we can solve this problem of friction and people don't know anything. So I basically reassign all the domains towards collocating the right domain in the right dev center. So for instance, in Amsterdam, we have the onboarding experience. And we have there, or the developer takes care about sign in, sign up, landing pages, stuff like that. In London, we have catalog and video player. that was the critical one because we have all the PMs there. So I basically redesign and reassign the domains based on what architecture we wanted to build and where the people were present. Because at the end of the day, we were building up Amsterdam, and for them that were doing or catalog or doing sign-in wouldn't change too much because they didn't even start it. So instead, if we were capable to co-locate similar, let's say, features under the same subdomain of my system in the same dev center, we will be in a specific and a great spot for then having the flow of information going very fast. And then each dev center has its own, let's say, ceremonies and meetings and whatever. And that worked like a charm. And even before, this was 2016, 2017. So it was like at least 2 or 3 years before Team Topology's book came out.
Mm-hmm.
So we were doing that way before. Obviously, Team Topologies make, let's say, these things like a pattern. But back in the days for us was groundbreaking. And when I was describing this on how we started with the architecture, remapped the team, reassigned the domains, using domain-driven design, deciding the different characteristics for different subdomains, people were astonished because, again, we were talking about almost 10 years ago.
How important is like a design system in a micro-frontend architecture?
I would say essential.
Essential. Yeah, I was thinking because
Yeah,
I was going to say, because, okay, you can make sure that the team communicates on higher level things, like they don't rebuild features, but you don't want every team to build their own drop-down menu or stuff like that. So you need someone to have ownership of shared code.
Absolutely. I fully agree. And I think nowadays there are a lot of great tools that helps you to keep up with the Micro-Frontends with the latest version of the design system. There are visual tools like bit.dev, for instance, created a tool for that. Or if you need just, let's say, a way to bump up the version across multiple Micro-Frontends, you can use Dependable. You just configure it on GitHub or GitLab or wherever you're using. And then that every night is scanning through all the package JSON and say, oh, by the way, there is the new version of React, and there's also the new version of your design system. And they open the PR. And I think that is extremely helpful. There are companies that are quite aggressive on that, and they rightly do so because maybe it's an e-commerce and they need to have like UX consistency. Exactly. Other companies that are more, let's say, relaxed into this part and they do still manually. But the configuration of the Dependable is, let's say, probably 20 minutes job, 1 hour if we want really to spend more time on that. But it's not less crazy.
One last question on micro-frontends, because you mentioned anti-patterns like global state. What other anti-patterns have you seen in the micro-frontend architecture?
Quite a few, actually. So first of all is blurring the line between components and micro-frontends. Very often the only thing that they understand about micro-frontends is the runtime composition idea. So that resonates immediately with people is, oh yeah, well, I can create my component and deploy when I want and load at runtime. But they don't understand that the micro-frontend is very different. It's domain aware. It doesn't need to have a lot of information to handle things. And the way how you design a micro-frontend and component are completely different. Component is designed for reusability as a first purpose. Micro-frontends are designed for reducing external dependency and having independent deployment. So those are two things that are at different side of the spectrum. Because if you want to reuse, you want to create something that is standardized and you want to apply everywhere. A micro-frontend is not for that because the micro-frontend is handling, let's say, team independence and less the duplication of code is acceptable. Like micro-frontends, there are some parts that are duplicated for a certain period of time or forever, depends from the use case. I think that is another anti-pattern. So the understanding how to design a proper micro-frontends, what are the boundaries of proper micro-frontends. Another one I've seen often is around when you do a migration. Because, for instance, if you have like the old system and you have the new system, the application shell maybe needs to change the way how is it composing a micro-frontend or how is communicating with this old legacy system just because we need to integrate it under the same umbrella. And that is something that is easily solvable. And I solved for a large financial company in Silicon Valley 8 years ago, 7 years ago, where basically if you think about that, what you really need is not touching the application shell. We said that should be as stable as possible. Instead, what you want is wrapping up the legacy part, one entire system or more, or in more granular fashion, up to you, into a meta shell that is basically sanitizing the communication between the old system and the new system, where the old system could even live in an iframe and communicate through post message to the meta shell, but the meta shell is sanitizing the communication from the old system to the current system, the Micro-Frontend system. So in this way, the moment that you are ready to ship the new Micro-Frontend, you don't have to touch the application shell. You don't have to touch anything else in the new system. You just load a different micro. And this is in microservices called anti-corruption layer. There is OpenOS, there is share kernel, there is anti-corruption layer. There are three ways, basically, that you can handle this kind of situation where you have an external world that has to enter in the new world. And if you use the meta-shell approach, you solve the problem like in no time. This is another anti-pattern. And probably the third one, very common, is around when you have like the same API called by multiple micro-frontends, especially when you have like a horizontal split. There is a challenge, right? Because you need to understand if you really need to call it twice, or if the micro-frontends is split correctly. Because it's very likely that maybe you need to review the boundaries. Maybe things change since when you designed the first micro-frontend, and now the same team should own the micro-frontend that is doing the two calls. So they create a larger micro-frontend and can handle just with a single call. Sometimes it's not possible, but you can leverage components inside micro-frontends. Therefore, one team is creating a component, the other one is responsible to inject the response of that call into the component, because no one is stopping us to use components and micro-frontends. So obviously the relation is always micro-frontends as one or multiple components, but components doesn't have any micro-frontend or shouldn't be loaded at runtimes. So I think those are the most common ones that I've seen over and over.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I think besides your book that's coming out next month, already out digitally if you want to buy it on Amazon, yes. Building Micro-Frontends by Luca, what other book would you recommend my listeners read? So
definitely Florian Rappo wrote the new edition of his book. I think it was published this year, if I remember well, or end of last year, something like that. And Florian is the creator of Pyral. It is a fantastic framework, battery included. There are plenty of stuff that are there. Florian also is a good friend of mine. I really like the way how he thinks about micro-frontends. He created a lot of stuff for the micro-frontends world. And he even organized a couple of conferences on micro-frontends in the past. So he's a very smart guy with a lot of ideas and experience on micro-frontends. So definitely something that I would recommend. Let me think. There is another one on React that I didn't read it. That was released a couple of years ago, if I remember well. It was React 17, React 18, if you remember well. But that's pretty much it. There is the vast majority of the knowledge of micro-frontends you can find on YouTube or on Medium or, let's say, other blogs. It's more likely to find, let's say, talks about micro-frontends than many books.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Luca. Thank you for joining me today.
You're welcome.
Was a super pleasure talk. I think I learned a lot. I'm super happy for this. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach me out on social. I'm always super keen to speak with the community.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
Cheers.